A racist police officer assumes that a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park. Late afternoon, sun casting a warm glow over the lush greenery. He turned a page in the book he was reading momentarily. Losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing the park was one of his favorite places. A small sanctuary in a bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job today, though. His thoughts were interrupted across the park. Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades. And in his mind, he knew this city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. A black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed. Suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts. Never seen him around here before. Brian muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead. But it was enough for Brian. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily. Prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book, slowly marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered as he started walking towards Marcus. His posture stiffened with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him. Didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine how it played out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an alien edge to it. Marcus could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm, and even he kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book he was fishing for something, anything to justify the feeling gnawing at. "I'm just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly. Though he wasn't really listening, he was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying and what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question there. Was that calmness? Again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate." Brian shot back his hand, moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus didn't move. He held Brian's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing faith, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID." Now for a moment the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Marcus knew he could push back and could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make the situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply. For now, without a word. He reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely. His body coiled like a spring. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. He'd already made up his mind. Stand up, Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly, but did as he was told. Rising slowly from the bench, he kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. Turn around, Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby could feel their eyes on him. But he stayed, calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give to anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. Now he grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him towards the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was, knew that this officer would find Wide Bidu Aras out soon enough. But he couldn't help but feel a deep weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that, despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people, like Officer Brian. Harkins, as they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The tension still hanging in the air, Marcus settled into the SE feet, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur, past wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkin drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something. Brian did. It weighed at him, made him question his instincts, but his pride wouldn't let him admit that Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful, but he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, an authority that Officer Harkin had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed, a guy like, "You just sitting around reading, you expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening when he finally spoke. His voice was cool, controlled. "And what does someone like me look like?" Officer Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving his frustration, mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot in Bryant Park near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out the cuff, still digging into Marcus's wrists as they walked toward the building. Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed, and challenging him with every word inside the precinct. The usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing, reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this?" About Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian. Caught him acting suspicious in the park. Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the